Hello, my name is Morgan Mattingly. I'm a PhD candidate at Queen's University Belfast, and this is Sustainable Development Goal 4 in Refugee Education, an Evaluative Framework for all level actors. This framework is for my master's and will hopefully be published soon, so keep an eye. As the 2030 deadline for Sustainable Development Goals, also known as SDGs, draws closer, it becomes necessary to evaluate to what extent SDG 4 is truly being enacted by those claiming to be working towards it. It's vital that special consideration be given to refugees and asylum seekers, hereafter known as RAS, as an underserved minority group to whom, in the words of UNESCO, active commitment must be given so they should not suffer any discrimination in access to learning opportunities. So why should RAS be given special consideration? For four main reasons. The number of RAS, 82.4 million people worldwide were forcibly displaced as of June 2021, and this doesn't include new numbers from Afghanistan, Somalia, or Ukraine. There's protracted precarity for RAS, who in statistics have been said to be spending up to 17 years in exile. However, this varies by country, as you can see in the chart at the bottom. And the number of RAS children enrolled in schools is actually significantly lower than global averages. Primary school, only 68% are enrolled. Secondary school, 34%. Higher education, 5%. And this also relates back to the importance of education delivery. Only since 2012 has the UNHCR developed a policy of incorporating children from refugee camps into national education systems in the hopes that they would have access to better quality curriculums and learning. So thus, we need to focus on refugees and asylum seekers. You may be asking, isn't there already a way to measure SDG 4? Yes, there is. There is an SDG Indicators Framework, which works to quantify the implementation of the SDGs globally, but not all actors can aggregate or quantify their impact. It's also important to note that not every category in the SDG Indicators Framework is disaggregated for internationally displaced people, refugees, or asylum seekers, since this element was actually only added in 2020. More focused framework is necessary for refugees and asylum seekers. The SDG Indicators Framework is inadequate because governments, international and local NGOs, education departments, schools, and many other actors all play roles in the delivery of education resources to refugees and asylum seekers. Therefore, an evaluative framework which can be applied to all levels of actors in education to better understand if they meet SDG 4 aims for refugees and asylum seekers is necessary. Rather than seeking to quantify impact, actors must qualitatively consider if the work they do is minimally good and does not perpetuate common barriers RAS experience in their education. So this presentation introduces the SDG 4 Evaluative Framework, also called SDG EF, or SDG 4 EF, which is designed to assess the provision of refugee and asylum seeker education resources across all levels of actors, especially because the Global Indicators Framework tends to be used only by international NGOs or governments. So, to develop an evaluative framework, it's vital to design it around the topic being examined. In education, it can be tempting to rely on quantitative measures of evaluation. However, with a focus on refugee education policy and design, it's important to also consider how human welfare and rights can be corroded by flimsy solutions. Explicit value judgments aren't necessary to answer the question, are current refugee and asylum seeker policy and resources in line with SDG 4? Rather, a firm theoretical foundation, understanding of the terminology, and study of the education barriers and experiences of refugees and asylum seekers guide the development of an evaluative framework to answer this question. So I started with Nussbaum's capabilities approach, shortened to the CA, which aims to measure what each person is able to do and be in a nuanced and interdisciplinary way as the theoretical foundation to inform the development of the SDG 4 EF. So I'm going to go into quite a bit of detail about the CA because it may be new to many. The CA provides a tool to be systematic in evaluation and has been used previously to critique education policies. It's well suited here as it can consider quality of life in a human way, enabling consideration of all the institutions that affect and work in refugee education. So the capabilities approach was originally proposed by Amartya Sen, an economist, as an alternative to gross domestic product, GDP, and as a means for evaluating human development. Sen's philosophies have an international impact, including consultation with the UN on the Human Development Reports or Human Development Index, HDI. Nussbaum's version differs from Sen in that she lists out 10 central capabilities that seek to name and protect areas of freedom so central that their removal makes a life not worthy of human dignity. The capabilities approach seeks to find underlying injustices and inequality of society, especially those resulting from discrimination or marginalization. This is particularly germane to the topic of refugee education, and importantly, Nussbaum's CA is applicable beyond development. Though many assume that if refugees and asylum seekers reach a developed nation, their education needs will be met. To what extent that's true is something that SDG 4EF must also be able to consider. The SDGs are globally applicable wherever RIS may live. What's different in Nussbaum's work is that she looks at capabilities at an individual level and then searches for measures of institutional support for them, like constitutional principles. In fact, the search for measures of support can be applied to the general policy or practices of institutions at different levels, not just constitutional. The CA is guided by ethics, moral rules and duties crafted and justified in a normative framework. The 10 central capabilities normative framework outlined by Nussbaum informs the SDG 4EF, supplemented by Education for All, or EFA, the social theories of Bordeaux to further explore the significance of education, and the terminology of SDG 4. So Robbins, in 2006, examined the CA and evaluative frameworks in practice across a wide range of fields to offer clear guidance for use, which aided in the development of SDG 4EF, though there's not quite enough time to explore it here. I should also mention that the CA has been called a rights-based approach, RBA, reimagined for its reliance on the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UDHR. However, the CA and RBA differ in scope and focus because the legal right to education is recognized in most nations, but to what extent that functions in practice is actually examined with the CA. And it's not within the remit of this presentation to justify the 10 central capabilities of Nussbaum's list. However, we do examine the normative basis for refugee education provisions, borrowing and explaining some relevant normative theories, and that's where Bordeaux comes in. Then, in order to address inequalities for RIS, evaluative processes must include specific barriers RIS experience in relation to their education, which is gathered from a scoping review of the academic literature on refugee education barriers and reports from international NGOs or INGOs to ensure they're not being perpetuated in current responses. Ideally, these barriers to education would be confirmed in a participatory action committee with RIS. However, that wasn't possible for the present version due to time constraints and limitations caused by COVID-19. So, Bordeaux's theories can be used to justify the significance of education for all, especially as it relates to a person's positioning in society. The forms of capital allow for a person to be an active participant in society. We can get this knowledge from Bordeaux's 1986 essay, Forms of Capital, with economic capital, what a person has, social capital, who a person knows, cultural capital, what a person knows, symbolic capital, and what shows these types of capital. This is a normative framework because capital is mentioned by so many international actors, from the World Bank to OECD. And these forms of capital were significant to selecting 3 of the 10 central capabilities which relate to education from Nussbaum's list: practical reason, senses, imagination and thought, and affiliation. These types of capital and their relation to the central capabilities are significant to illustrate the corrosive disadvantages perpetuated by inequalities in education. For example, affiliation and social capital. Engaging with peers in school creates connections that enable a person to move smoothly through society. This also relates to Bourdieu's theory of habitus. Habitus acknowledges that certain dispositions tend to derive from social background and familial upbringing. However, educational institutions can offer multiple forms of capital to expand opportunities normally limited by habitus, which thus explains the significance of EFA, or Education for All. So for the evaluative framework, I pulled 5 terms or tenets from SDG 4. These definitions are more problematized in the paper, but for now, these inform the question, are current RIS education policy and resources in line with SDG 4? We have inclusive, equitable, quality, lifelong, and opportunities, all drawn from the terminology of SDG 4. So notice that within the definition of inclusion, diverse needs should be paid attention to, meaning monolingualism shouldn't be the only focus. Also, reducing exclusion within and from education is significant there, because not only are RIS excluded from education at time, but a person can be excluded within education when diversity isn't appreciated. Equity in part means to be impartial, just, and fair, ensuring equal opportunities for success. Focus is not only on, and then for quality, focus is not only on teaching and learning in classrooms, but also learner well-being, curriculum relevance, teaching and learning quality, and environmental suitability. In other words, the same principles that underlie inclusive education. So quality education is broadly defined with many important facets to consider in evaluation and demonstrates overlap in good practice concepts. I also mentioned some of Nussbaum's direct theories about adequacy that include literacy, basic mathematical, and scientific training to explain some of the bare minimum things that education should provide. Lifelong is also significant because education should be available no matter your age. And opportunities is significant because it asks, is a person able to choose what to do or be with the support provided by education quality and institutions? Significantly, I also add in dignity as a tenet. So the foundations of Nussbaum's theory come from the UDHR's principle of universality, and the preamble begins with recognition of the inherent dignity and equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family. So this is also incorporated as a central tenet. So this brings us to the SDG 4EF, where the theoretical conceptualizations of capabilities and realities of barriers to refugee and asylum seeker education comes to fruition. So 3 of Nussbaum's capabilities begin the list, and then SDG 4 tenets, and then realities of barriers inform the list beneath the tenets. There's multiple realizability within Nussbaum's list and within the SDG 4EF. So its members can be more concretely specified in accordance with local beliefs or customs. So this means that though there is a central list of universal capabilities from Nussbaum, and here, those capabilities can be further specified to the context being investigated. So the scoping review revealed general barriers to education for refugees and asylum seekers, but if participatory research occurs in each context, a more robust list of potential barriers to education can be found, and this can be further adapted to local contexts. By no means is this list complete. So there's not a significant amount of time to talk about all of the reasons for why these different points are beneath the tenets, but I'll talk about at least a few. So Dryden-Peterson found 3 common epistemic themes among education of refugees in countries of first asylum: language barriers, teacher-centered pedagogy, and discrimination in school settings. All of these factors affect the quality of refugee education with potential for continual impact, and it informs several of the factors beneath the tenets. So language falls beneath the inclusive tenet with 2 points: diversity and being among social peers. So in her study across 14 countries of asylum, Dryden-Peterson found most children had to transition to a different language of instruction. Though being multilingual is advantageous, focus only on language is detrimental because refugee children spend a disproportionate amount of time learning languages while often falling behind in age-appropriate academic content. Thus, valuing diversity as it relates to language is important. Also, Dryden-Peterson found older students are frequently placed in lower grades to allow for language development, which impacts content and rate of learning, as well as social capital built among social peers. So that's included in the list. The ill effects of teacher-centered pedagogy is addressed in teacher training beneath equitable. Discrimination is addressed beneath the tenet of dignity. Dryden-Peterson learned of regular discrimination experiences from both the curriculum and the conduct of peers and teachers. Feelings of inferiority and negative experiences are carried long into the future and can lead to a wariness of teachers in schools. Thus, the value of identity and well-being fall beneath the tenet of dignity. So these markers don't represent the only criteria that should be evaluated, but it can be used for national, developed, or local policy evaluation, as well as national or local charities in a simple way. So if any organization wishes to evaluate if they truly meet SDG 4, the SDG 4 EF is a promising tool. Thank you so much. Special acknowledgements to Dr. Fiona Murphy, who supervised my MA and now is part of the team for my PhD alongside Dr. Allison McKenzie. If you need to reach out to me, here's my email, and keep an eye out for the full paper.